Our second speaker today is Dr. Liran Razinsky, who is currently a researcher, a teaching fellow both at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and at Tel Aviv University, and as of September 2011, a lecturer at Bar-Ilan University. Previously, he was a postdoctoral researcher at New York University, and he has published many papers on Jonathan Littell's The Kindly Ones, Les Bienveillantes, Notot HaChesed, on Georges Bataille, on Freud, on psychoanalysis, and such journals as Yale French Studies, Modern Language Quarterly, Contemporary Psychoanalysis, the Psychoanalytic Review, and other journals. Among his research interests are 20th century French literature, Holocaust literature, French theory, critical theory, psychoanalysis, and death. His book, Freud, Psychoanalysis and Death, is about to be published next year at Cambridge University Press, and he's going to talk to us today about Between Victim and Perpetrator, Torture and Writing in Yellow by Elias Khoury.
Thank you. Well, I have to start with an apology. As Moshe said, I've changed not only the title of my lecture, but also my lecture as a whole, and I will not be speaking about what I was supposed to speak, but about this book, Yellow, by Elias Khoury. So for those of you who came here to hear about the missing experience, you're going to have sort of a missing experience because I'm not going to talk about this. And if you came to hear about death, well, don't worry, there is death, there is rape, torture, massacre. You won't be disappointed. Okay, so let's start. Right, you dog, screamed the man. It is in an interrogation room in a dark, prison that we meet Yellow, the main protagonist of a novel by that name by Elias Khoury. Khoury's novel, published in 2002, is among the best-known novels of Arab literature in recent years. Yellow's interrogation moves from fists and threats to torture of various sorts. It is after being severely tortured that Yellow is presented with a difficult demand. He is given in his prison cell a pile of writing paper and is asked to write the whole story of his life. "Write, you dog," screamed the man. The demands are quite concrete. The guard tells Yellow, a man's life needs at least 50 pages. And Yellow only has 1 month to write it. Over and over, when the torture session is finished, after every episode, Yellow finds himself wounded and humiliated in his tiny cell. And over, the white paper and the pot of black ink await him. He writes several versions of his life story, one after the other, but these versions are judged inadequate by either his interrogators or himself. It is a little autobiography, then, a confession that Yellow writes, but he does so because he was ordered to under the threat of death. Never has intimate writing been more literally close to death. It is the letter that kills. Rather than as an argumentative statement, I intend this lecture as a kind of exploration of one particular case of the discourse of trauma and testimony in a text which I see as itself a complex interpretation of that discourse. The novel describes the unfolding of the interrogation accompanied by torture. Yellow, nickname of Daniel Jalau, an ex-fighter in the Lebanese civil war, who has become the guard of Avira near Beirut, lives a solitary life in his isolated hut in a pine forest. From there, he takes off in the night to swoop down on cars in the forest and surprise the couples making love in them. He robs them of what he can and forces the women to have sex with him. Now, in his interrogation, he is asked about his relationship with these women and about the vague affair of a group that was supposedly planning to use explosives for terrorist attacks. Here he is now, in the novel's first pages, in the interrogation room, where the interrogator asks him to admit his deeds, and where his lover, Shirin, one of those he had found on his nightly forays, and who became his lover, comes to testify against him. It is a strange encounter. What the text of the novel brings to light is the rapprochement, the fusion of the discourse of love, of intimacy, and of truth, and the violent discourse of police interrogation, with all the weight the latter also places on the notions of truth and confession. Love and torture share interest in truth, but not only that, and I quote, "Then, in the torture chambers, that is, Yallo understood. Confession under torture is like lover's confession to his beloved. Suddenly, the lover loses the power to hold his tongue and says things that destroy his love." Now that Shirin is on the side of the interrogator, the slow work of reinterpretation begins. Everything that Yallo had murmured in the sweet hours of love in the ears of his lover is thrown back at his face, shouted by the interrogator. Every gesture of love is reinterpreted as harassment, as violence. Every detail, every scene undergoes that painful work of reinterpretation. From the moment it enters the objective domain of the interrogation, love fades, and I quote, "How is Yallo to convince the interrogator about love when the interrogator is holding a thick wad of papers which he says have in them information about Danielle?" End of quote. The symbol for the deformed reflection of the discourse of love in the violent police interrogation is the ring Yallo gave Shirin as proof of his love. That ring reappears in the hand of the interrogator as proof against him, evidence that he had harassed Shirin. The ring of love had become the ring of accusation. End of quote. Curiously, the effect of this is more than the alienation of intimate discourse, for bit by bit, with the progression of the interrogation, the violent nature of the intimate relation with Shirin is discovered or constructed. Through the reflection in that deforming mirror, Yallo discovers the violent, abusive nature at the heart of his love relationship with Shirin. In fact, this objectification is the fate of the entire personal history of Yallo and that of his family. Everything intimate is put through the same chewing machine of torture and interrogation. The strange objectification, the petrification of the intimate in the microcosmos of the interrogation is but one element in a strange fusion that is created in the novel between the text of the victim and that of the executioners, the torturers. Thus, for example, the prose of Yallo is very repetitive. Time and again we hear the same stories with minor variations, as if some episodes were entirely writing themselves. Such repetitiveness, we all know, is the structure of trauma. But here, the repetition is forced, imposed by the demands of the interrogator, who is never happy with the result, with Yallo's variable productions. When it is Yallo himself who self-imposes the creation of yet another version of his confession, it is because he places himself in the position of his interrogators, adopting their judgment. Thus again, the intimate psychic life love is taken over by the interrogation and the torture. Similarly, the fragmentation of Yallo's testimony, the difficulty in establishing the fact, the absence of a coherent narrative, all belong to the disturbed memory which results from trauma. But they also all concretely result from the interrogatory condition where Yallo's words are slashed by the interrogators, where alternative interpretations and narrative are repeatedly presented to him and undermine his self-confidence, spawning doubt and ambiguity. In the pages containing Yallo's confessions unite the voice of the torturer and that of the victim. Here, the confession of the tortured victim is a text written in two hands, that of the victim and that of the interrogator. It is the synthesis of the exigencies of the latter, a specific, invited story, a dictated story, and the effort of the former, the victim, to nevertheless place something of his intimate truth in them. For Yallo, there is even more. His writing is for him a true attempt at finding, for the very first time, a hidden logic in the dispersed, incoherent, and lost life. In his lost life. There is in torture in general a kind of morbid reflection. The torturer's voice is reflected in that of the victim. The response of the one tortured is nothing but the affirmation of the question of the torturer. I'm speaking here in a general manner, okay? A morbid duplicity is built. Speech is taken away from the victim, who becomes the echo of the torturer. The interrogation creates a word in itself, closed and isolated. In the quasi-total absence of external stimulants, the voice of the interrogator becomes almost that of a god. He is the standard, the unique measure of truth. Shaped by the interrogator, the whiteness of the page is not free. All of this becomes more complex in Yellow. It is true that Yellow admits the real rapes and the unreal bomb affair, but at no point in his text does he become an echo of the voice of the torturer. His written mini-autobiographies profit from the openness and expansion which are characteristic of a literary text, and become a place of subjective expansion rather than contraction. Yellow himself is aware of this. It is thanks to the order to write down the story of his life that he was brought, he says, to remember well-hidden memories. For Elaine Scarry, in a well-known The Body in Pain, the objectification of physical suffering seems to be an essential part of the logic of torture. What the torturer seeks in the final account is to give symbolic support to the values of the regime and to himself as its agent. It is the confession that does the work of objectification. In Yellow, it is the text, Yellow writes, that in principle should have allowed this objectification of suffering. What takes place, however, in Yellow is that instead of objectifying suffering, these texts, because they form a literary effort on the part of Yellow, because they bring about a true work of memory, undo rather than unite, liquidize identities rather than solidify them. Rather than empty the subjective world of the tortured, the interrogators in Yellow only fill it with memories and thoughts. The goal of the torturer is to reduce the psychic world of the tortured to crumbs, but in Yellow the memories accumulate and the perspective grows larger. The torturer wishes, as Emery famously claimed, to make the victim into flesh and become, Elaine Scarry adds, himself purely verbal. But in Yellow, Yellow becomes pure spirit and words, leaving the body behind him. More on that in a few moments. We have then a strange combination, uniting the experience of writing, the search for personal truth, and the reconstruction of the past, and the threat, the violence, and exigencies of torture, with a strange equivalence that is suggested between these two modalities. The anxieties of writing, the difficulty of reconstruction of the past, the choices necessary at every word, and the hesitation facing one's past, all these experiences are transferred from the intimate sphere of writing into the sphere of the prisoner in his cell, and all acquire completely different meanings. All the considerations of writing about one's past experience are here enclosed in an over-literal practice. Where to begin his story? How to end it? Let us take just one question, the question of details, the density of the story. How many details should Yellow provide, and which ones? It is a literary choice, but this choice must also be calculated in order not to incriminate Yellow in anything. If details are missing, he will be accused of lying. If he supplies too many, these details will become the net that traps him. Yellow discovers slowly that whatever he writes, anything can be used against him. The description of the squid, the words first writer, is instructive here. A metaphor so rich I'm tempted to cite the whole of it. So I quote, Yellow saw the sheets of white paper and the pens, and he yearned for the smell of ink in his grandfather's room, and understood the essence of the secret of the squid, and Junun, the squid, which the ancient Arabs called the inker. It came to him that this creature was the first to discover writing, because with its ink it wrote its defense and its resistance to death. It misled its enemies by releasing its ink into their faces and disappeared into the black thicket of ink. Into the black thicket its ink had traced within the waters of the sea. Yellow is alone in his cell. He has, the citation continues, yes? He has to release the ink onto the sheets of paper. He is like the squid. All he possesses to squirt and mislead the fishermen and escape death is the weapon of ink. But, alas, if the sea creature should fall into the fisherman's net, for then they will cook it in its ink. It occurred to Yellow that he would be cooked in the ink he was writing with, that the black ink that flowed across the sheets of paper would kill him, and that he was incapable of misleading the fisherman, who was waiting for his writings so that he could wrap him up in them and kill him and eat him. He wrote and wrote like a squid going to its death. Yellow understands that he will never be able to express his innocence with words. This is why the white sheets of paper are the biggest torture. Caught between the walls of the prison cell and the wall of the white pages in front of him, Yellow knows writing is the true torture. He knows, the narrator tells us, that this was a frequent practice in the Arab world. The sessions of torture culminate in the ultimate torment in which the prisoner had to sit on an empty broken collar bottle. If he survives, he is asked to write the story of his life. And I quote, "This is when the real torture began, when writing was transformed into a murder weapon and a form of suicide. The words coming to resemble knives, stabbing their owner, who would descend into an abyss he dug for himself, slipping on the letters and falling into the blood that took on the color of ink." Being a tortured prisoner, Yallo is doubtless a victim. But he is not merely a victim. He's also a robber and a rapist, and as we slowly come to understand. But before this, Yallo was a fighter, and he was made close acquaintance with violence and cruelty. The first time they came to arrest him, they covered his head with a sack. But he's not frightened, and I cite, "The fighters had been the sack's masters." End of citation. And Yallo was one of them. He himself covered others' head with a sack. And I quote, "He'd known that the game of darkness was part of the game of war, and that he was now entering the other side of a world he had come to know well." His victimhood, on the other hand, goes beyond his present moment in prison. It is the condensation of the bleeding history of Lebanon. His real victimhood, one that slowly gains centrality in his written text, is not only personal but a transmitted historical trauma. Raised by his grandfather, a strange, idiosyncratic and austere man, eternally in anxiety, Yallo lives amongst the memories of the massacre of the little Assyrian people in the village Envad, near Tur Abdin, at the beginning of the 20th century. Of this massacre, contemporary with the more known Armenian massacre, Yallo's grandfather was one of the only survivors. It is through his grandfather that Yallo becomes sensible to words. And I quote, "We have to learn," the grandfather says, "we have to learn how to read the words that have been rubbed out. This is our story. We are a people whose story has been rubbed out and whose language has been rubbed out. And if we don't learn to know, if we don't learn how to read what has been erased, we will lose everything." End of quote. Could this be Yallo's justification? In his cell, facing the white pages, he asked himself this question. I quote, "He stood up and paced back and forth, trying to organize his memory. I must find a thread that ties the story together," thought Yallo, and the thread of blood that stretches from Envad to Beirut sketched himself before him. "That is my thread," he thought. "I started there with my grandfather, all the members of whose family were killed in the massacre. Who can pass a judgment on a man who has been slaughtered? I will write that I am a man who has been slaughtered. I am Daniel, son of the slaughtered." The more the versions of the story accumulate, the more he approaches the story of his grandfather and his people. It is only towards the end, when he admits he no longer knows why he writes, for all the crimes have been confessed, that Yallo finally comes to write about that other crime, not his own, the crime of which his people has been victim, a crime that was not written, a little secondary massacre, remembered by no one, attached to that larger massacre of the Armenians, a massacre of a people who no longer exists, and where, I quote, "the butcher will see no need to wipe the blood of his knives." Yallo's actual suffering, his past acts, his victim state, and his perpetrator state, all arrive at a sort of closure or limit in that historical source of suffering of which Yallo, who belongs to a second generation of survivors, was also a victim. In parenthesis, I'll say that the strongest violence is perhaps that which is situated for the most part outside the text, that of the Lebanese civil war. Little is said about it, but we know Yallo is a Christian and that he was fighting for the Christian phalangists who perpetrated the Saba and Shatila massacre. One suspects that the entire interrogation is led along a track that only serves either as camouflage or as emblem for that other track, not much talked about in the book, Yallo's own past in the war, or the war altogether, and even the entire bloody history of that miserable country, Lebanon. Yallo has never left his real prison, Lebanon. The permanent war, the historical suffering of his family and his people. He never knew anything else. That is why I cannot understand the difference between making love and rape. The blurring of identities between victim and perpetrator, on which the text insists and of which I gave an example earlier, is profoundly linked to this bleeding Lebanese history. In another text by HUJI, Babel Shams, he summarizes in sentences all the difficulties of the gray zone. You would like it all to be clear and simple. The murderer must be identified, the victim likewise, and justice must be done. But sir, sadly that isn't how it goes. It isn't something that one can reduce to us and them. It's something not known, escaping all definition. We witness throughout the text Yallow's voyage towards writing, which becomes his redemption. Yallow's art before becoming a writer in spite of himself was calligraphy. He had always written then in the most material way possible. The text contains many allusions to Yallow's difficulties expressing himself with language. He feels somewhat lost at the beginning. So I quote, "Had he been a novelist, he would have written his memoirs to a consistent rhythm and called them Enwald, starting with his grandfather as a young boy and how he lived through the massacre of his village. Had Yallow been a storyteller, he would have sat in the prison and told of Yallow, who fought like no one else ever had. Had he been, but he wasn't. Yallow was a young man trying to read in the whiteness of the paper his own story, which he didn't know how to tell, and his language, which he didn't know how to write, and his memory, which he didn't know how to articulate." However, the more he spends time with the white pages, the more the intimate inquiry into memory progresses, the more purified Yallow feels, and the more his writing breaks free from the concrete demands. It is the act of writing his life, Yallow feels, that makes him a new person, different from the criminal he has been before. In fact, his recognition of his culpability goes hand in hand with the deepening of his self-understanding and the maturation of his literary expression. Finally, Yallow possesses an entire story, but at the price of being gradually dispossessed of this story and of his history. Yallow becomes alienated from his own image that seems to him, looking in the mirror, the image of another man who scares him. This is the result of torture and of the enormous psychological suffering, but it is also the result of writing. Yallow realizes, in writing the story of his life, that, and quote, his life was not real. The life he'd written came to him from shredded, incomplete stories, and he saw himself in those stories as though it wasn't him, end of quote. There is another side to it. It is also through that very writing that Yallow arrives for the first time at something like self-understanding and succeeds in giving himself a true account of his life. This double course of auto-alienation and auto-discovery and integration culminates in a dissociative experience at the moment of the final, most dreadful torture I mentioned earlier, called the throne, where Yallow, under the tremendous and unbearable pain, leaves his mutilated body behind to find the so much awaited redemption. Body and mind separate. Daniel is left to write the story of Yallow, now called the King of the Dead. The story of his past life moves from the first to third person, and the road to spiritual purification is complete. Surrounded by the smell of his own excrement, paralyzed by the thought that it is impossible to succeed in the task of writing his entire life, Yallow suddenly decides to add one page to his already written confession, to put down some general ideas he had, to tell a story. This is the moment when Yallow moves away from the practical need of writing towards writing itself, towards art. Torture has become the way towards writing, finally freed from practical needs. With the complete version in his hands, his story finished, Yallow is dumbfounded at hearing the interrogator tell him that they have no need for his life story, because they already know everything, and that they have found the explosives again, and know Yallow had nothing to do with it. The interrogator bursts in a roar of laughter and throws the paper on the wet floor, shouting, "The story of your life!" The papers are ruined, but this moment of disappointed is also a moment of total liberation of literature, which had been subject to the interrogation. Having become useless for the interrogation, his story has become really his story, and literature achieves an independent status. Later, in his prison, Yallow will write his story for himself alone. we have then a marvelous exploration in this text by HUJI of questions of trauma and testimony, of experience and writing. The time order is switched. The process of testimony is taking place here within another trauma, the trauma inflicted on Yalo in present time, releases the testimonial process of both his own past miseries and the historical traumas of which he was a victim as a second generation, as well as his testimony about the crimes he himself perpetrated. All this as part of a subjective moment of crystallization, even redemption, through writing. Roles of victims and perpetrators are switched and blurred, and mostly truth, memory, and narrative in the telling of one's past are repositioned between two possible contradicting readings or interpretations, Yalo's and his torturers. I wish to say, to conclude, a few words about us as readers. I mentioned the difficulty in distinguishing victims and perpetrators here. But since from the very beginning we meet Yalo on the chair of the interrogated prisoner, he immediately gains our empathy. This empathy, which is also due to his childish side, like a child who never grew up, creates a kind of a cognitive barrier. It is difficult later on to understand the facts we are told and to see among the facts the alarmingly cruel aspects of his acts. We are here very much like Yalo himself, who cannot see what was wrong in his relationship with Shirin or in his nightly raids. How to tell a story, where to begin, how to end, what to include and what to leave out. Who am I at bottom? These are the questions Yalo continuously poses himself. His difficulty in writing his life story reflects his ambiguous position between victim and perpetrator, for he is both on the same time. This ambiguous position and Yalo's own hesitation as to what he is prevents us as well from forming a simple judgment. It is us, as a matter of fact, who receive over and over a pile of new white paper and who have to draw in our minds Yalo's portrait. It is us over and over who fail to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Razinsky. And one question? Yeah.
Thank you for that. You proposed me from English and Cultural Studies at Hebrew University. You provoked me to revisit one of the exemplary texts of the South African canon on torture, which blurs distinctions between victims and perpetrators. Jacob Steers Waiting for the Barbarians, written in response to the death and detention and torture of Stephen Bantu Biko. But in an essay, a theoretical essay on this, Kutsia invokes Freud's Oedipus scene, as well as the complicity, the necessary complicity, the structural complicity between the writer and the torturer, in a way that would suggest a less optimistic reading for the possibility of writing that breaks free from concrete demands, in that it said plain that the writer has no choice but to follow the torturer and the state apparatus into a certain voyeuristic fascination of death that replays an Oedipal dynamic. So my question here is about who.
Well, one simple answer would be that this is another interpretation, and it goes well with Scary and many others who have tried to articulate the junction between writing and voice and torture. I think, much of HUJI's writing is about telling stories. The Bab el-Shams is just one big collection of refugee stories, and since he also deals a lot with the history of Lebanon, I think he needed that pessimistic, that optimistic moment. But I would also say that I think there is a strong influence of the French tradition, theoretical tradition, and there is I didn't speak much about it, but much of these, many of these hesitations about writing and the disappearing and the dissociation and of author and text, etc., actually echo French theoretical writing. So maybe this is also one way from which he got to this specific mixture. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I thank all of you. I want to remind you that there are copies here of the partial answers, and including a journal on a special issue on eyewitness narratives that is very likely to interest some of you.